Imagining the Divine, Part 1.
All right, this is Jack Donovan with PH2T3R, Pater, the Journal of Solar Culture. And I'm here with C.B. Robertson today, and we're going to talk about the shape of gods. How are gods represented? Because there's two different perspectives on it. And I'm going to start out with a quote from Thomas Carlyle's On Heroes, Hero Worship, and the Heroic in History, which is a fantastic book. It's straight fire. I was just reading through it, and it was hard to even pick a quote because there's so many great things in there that I think pertain to solar idealism. But what I like about Thomas Carlyle's work, especially this first essay, and I had read it originally because it pertained to Odin and the Germanic gods and so forth, is that it gets to a very preternatural, elemental sense of the gods. Something that primitive man might have thought. That's a kind of pre-language almost. And so the quote that I pulled up here is, "To the wild, deep-hearted man, all was yet new, not veiled under names or formulas. It stood naked, flashing in on him there, beautiful, awful, unspeakable. Nature was this to man. What to the thinker and prophet? It forever is preternatural." And then skipping over to the next page, it said, "The world, which is now divine only to the gifted, was then divine to whosoever would turn his eye upon it." And the reason why I picked that quote is because that influenced my perception of the ideas of gods. And as I explained in Fire in the Dark, I'd like to think of gods as projections of our highest selves. We see what is a perfected, almost platonic forms, like what is the perfected version of me? And that is what becomes our God. And that falls in line with his thesis in the heroes and hero worship, in sense of like man is a natural hero worshiper. Like we worship the best version of ourselves, and we don't know how to do anything else. That's kind of what we do. And so I liked that, but it struck me while I was building Voldegang and while I was creating pagan altars and so forth years ago, that the idea of these concepts of nature being just by themselves self-evident in the world before they had names or personifications. And that struck me as being very powerful. And so I, at that time, and I'm open to both sides, and that's why we're having this discussion, and why it's interesting, is that at that time I was thinking, I like symbols better than like statues in terms of perceiving the gods, because it becomes less cartoonish and more like, this is a bigger thing than I could possibly picture. This is a bigger thing that I can imagine. This is like just see lightning and the storm. This is what that is. Whereas, I was contrasting it in my mind at the time, and this is not the only contrast or the only argument, but in my mind, I was contrasting it with the idea of, a silly little statue of Thor. Like here's a silly little Marvel character thing, or like something that some guy carved up that's kind of cartoonish and goofy, versus lightning. Like there's just a huge gulf there. And the other thought that I had on that, and then we'll get into all the other stuff that we have to talk about, which is a lot, is that as someone who has put out t-shirts and put things out on the market and so forth, I'm very hesitant always to put a guy on a guy, in terms of, I as a man, I don't want to wear a picture of another man on a t-shirt. I feel like that's weird, even though it's not really. That's why I've always used skeletons and things like that, because those are elemental and those are ideas. Once it gets to be a guy, I'm like, I'm just kind of worshiping this guy, like this, this drawing of this cartoon or this guy. And then that becomes like a different thing. I like to keep it a little bit more abstract. And there is one more thing that, and we'll get into this maybe a little bit later too, is that one of the issues is that, especially looking at solar idealism in the modern context, once you put a face on something, you racialize it and also tribalize it, which historically would be perfectly fine because that's how religions were. They were all tribal. But in trying to reach a kind of cross-cultural, cross-ethnic audience, the second you make God look like a Viking, then like he doesn't appeal to somebody, whereas the idea of him could appeal very much. And so it becomes kind of a push and pull there with those ideas. So anyway, let's get started and get into this. You had some things that you wanted to bring up. It's like the question, I guess, of the whole show is like, should we depict the gods or let them be symbols or ideas? And are symbols and ideas, as you just brought up before the show, symbols and ideas still just like personifying gods? Or just, are they human inventions? So what are your thoughts so far?
Well, my first thought is I'm glad I took off my Che shirt before I got on here. But I mean, when I was, working out my thoughts on Christianity, which has a very interesting, a few years ago, a very interesting sort of position on this whole thing. The Christian church was very iconoclastic for the first 6 centuries of its existence. And then a guy named John Damascus came around and wrote a polemic defending icons. And that stuck with the Catholic and Orthodox Church, and that was sufficient for them. I thought his argumentation was a little dubious, but the argument there was that, and we see this in other religious traditions too, particularly in the Nordic traditions. He says God himself uses icons and makes images, and there are a couple ways you could go. You could say, well, God is an ideal that we should emulate, or this is a special privilege that only God can have. Mm-hmm. Now, if you are, lean in that, Carlylean Odinic path, Odin is definitely more of maybe part of an ideal to emulate, not the whole thing critically. But, his wisdom in the use of runes is something that is not like limited to him, and you should avoid learning. And you should avoid representation in poetry or anything. It's like, no, these are skills to take on just as you would take on the skills of Thor or Freyr or these other deities.
Yeah, he leaves us drops of meads of poetry as the eagles flying back up in the sky. Yeah,
exactly. And so if the gods themselves use, icons and images and representations, perhaps in the form of bird signs, what does a bird sign represent? Is that a symbolic depiction of something that is to come? Is language itself something like that? Those are the sorts of questions that I think one could ask. And unfortunately, it's such a deep subject. We're just bringing up interesting and thoughtful questions is probably the best we can do. I don't know how whether we'll be able to get it to any kinds of answers, but I think the main thing that people are concerned about is sort of like what you said. Are you diminishing the grandeur of this elemental force, this force in the universe that is, if not supernatural, then at least superhuman, by depicting it in an anthropomorphized form, in a human form? And it's a serious concern because how things are represented sort of shape how we think about them. But the contrary, the sort of opposite side of that might be, well, the human mind is designed to think socially. We pick up on social cues in other people, especially faces and body posture and expressions. And we're so attuned to that where we see faces where there aren't faces in clouds or in water or places. So if these deities, if these ideals, these spirits or forces or gods have some kind of character that it's important to know and to understand, then is the best way to depict that and to convey that going to be through an abstraction that people have to decode consciously in a very almost like mathematical, symbolic way through language? Or is it going to be something that people immediately understand viscerally because that's how their brain works, i.e. through some kind of human or humanoid form? And maybe you do that directly the way that the Greeks often did, or maybe you do that in a kind of mixed way, well, the way the Hindus did, where we're gonna give him a human form, but he's gonna have black skin and 8 arms. So he's not a human.
Right.
But you can still get an attitude and a persona that you get visually from this, and it feels like a tricky thing to balance.
And it seems like there are different levels of discourse with everything. And there's that, as we could say, there's this academical level of discourse that needs to happen, and there's a popular level and all these things. And one of the levels that this needs to happen on, especially if you're going to raise children in a mythological frame, is that first social thing that you're talking about, that social form, that personification of a god, becomes very important, because for you to explain this abstract concept to a small child is much harder than it is to you and I as adults. We can sit about it and think about it like that and perceive it in that way. But so many myths, if you really think about it, especially when I look at when I look at the Norse myths now, I'm like, they almost read like children's stories to me. And a lot of the myths are like that, from a lot of cultures. And when we just read the Native American myths, I'm like, these are the myths this is how you tell the children how the world works. And we grow up with these myths, and then they become bigger for us, I think, and more complex as adults. But for children, you need a simple story. And this is what he looks like. And this is what, so that they can picture it in their head. And I mean, you have kids, I don't have kids, but that seems to me that's maybe a lot of the purpose of some of the personification and storytelling, is to get to that simple core and communicate it quickly. Yeah. And also, there's children, but there's also adults too. And I've also often felt the need with solar idealism, like, if you can draw the striker, then all of a sudden you have him on people's walls. And you have him on posters, and they can envision him as a particular guy, and they can really connect with him. And that's what people do with all these myths. All these guys have an exact idea what they think Thor looks like, and that's who they connect with. That form.
And it's a tool. It's a way to keep these ideas close, because if you have, a tome or a scroll that you have to unroll and read and understand all the philosophical nuances and points, that you can't truly know in a positive sense who this deity is, only via negativa, what he is not, and thereby sort of triangulate his or its true nature in these very abstract concepts. And there's a conversation to be had about that in a minute. Like, if your goal is to, in some sense, embody or remember this, symbols or icons become a very convenient shorthand to keep that close and keep that on your mind. And I mean, that's how we use language, and that's how we have always used hieroglyphs and symbols. This signifies that as a shorthand, so that we don't have to re-explain everything in perfect detail. We can have maps instead of walking over the terrain every time. But
that's what I was talking about with runes last time. Last time we did this with runes, it's like, well, that's a little tiny picture for a big idea, and that's what all these things really are. And that's what our symbols are for the Order of Fire and solar idealism, and even something like picking up a Vajra. I mean, okay, well, now I'm holding a thunderbolt, and that connects me directly to this god that held a thunderbolt. And this whole idea of holding a thunderbolt, and that becomes it's a bigger thing, and that's why it's exciting. That's what people like to hold spears and swords for the same reason. They connect them immediately with myth, even though that your chance of getting a sword fight is pretty low. I mean, you could start one, but your chance of being called out into a sword fight, unless that's what you do, is pretty low.
Yeah, fairly slim. But going back a minute to the children's depictions, which is funny. I was reading a children's version of the Odyssey just an hour ago, where no one got et by Scylla. Everyone survived in this version, and Odysseus made it off Circe's island, still faithful, and all this. But like, those kinds of details aside, you still have these personifications, and it's easy to say, oh, the anthropomorphizations are a neat and kind way to present these things to children, and the more abstract, higher level concepts are more mature and more adult. And I mean, but there is the question, are conceptualizations and abstractions any less human projections, somehow less products of the human mind than an anthropomorphization, in terms of how directly we might convey or describe a thing? Imagine the process of an artist and how they might think of depicting an entity. The history of language seems to be the history of increasingly precise metaphors, and the transformation of what were once metaphorical descriptions into reification isn't the word, is it? What was originally a metaphor becomes understood as the thing itself. So in Homer, because my mind always goes there, these were like Proto-Indo-European people being described as crossing a sea before they had a functioning language to describe sea travel. They were that new to the water. So some of the verbs that Homer uses to describe the motion of the boats on the waves was the broad ridges of the sea. They're using land adjectives, steppe land adjectives, and the motions of chariots as metaphors to describe the motion of boats. And if you're trying to describe a god, one would imagine the more from that way that language works, the more direct depiction of the nature of a god would actually not be a conceptualization or an abstraction, but a personification, a depiction of some kind of character metaphorically through the, I'm trying not to sound too much like Jordan Peterson here, through the perceptive categories that our mind naturally uses to process what we see and experience in the world. And so, given how secondary and even tertiary many of our concepts are when we talk about, fill in the blank with any Greek root word, conceptualization itself is a good example. That's not an immediately visual term. When someone says conceptualization, what do you think of? It's a stand-in for a stand-in for a stand-in that we have developed an understanding of. But these are actually more human in their construction often than the personifications, despite the personifications literally looking like people, which is an odd paradox to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know that we're capable of doing things that aren't human, because that's because that's what we are.
You're a human. Do something inhuman.
Yeah, exactly. How is that possible? It's like that's why I always hate the natural law arguments. Like how are you doing things that's not natural because it's impossible for you to do that because you're a creature of nature. But
Nietzsche have some line where he said it was probably impossible for people to do anything that was harmful to the race, to humankind. anymore. He was very critical of the English notion of morality, where morality is what is beneficial to the human race, and immorality is what we have collectively understood to be harmful to the human race. And he's like, really? He's very, very skeptical of that.
Well, he just hated the English, but
He did. That too.
But yeah, I mean, that sounds actually very much like our modern society is like, but that's used in propaganda sense. Like this is killing our species, therefore you have to do X, Y, or Z. Whereas there's some of that is real, like, the moment that they decided to make an atomic bomb was, probably not the best idea. But especially when they weren't sure if it was going to set the atmosphere on fire or whatever. But that would be, I think, legitimately harmful to our species. But as far as like, can we do things that are unnatural? I don't believe that's possible. We can do things that are unadvisable and are not good best practices. But we can't do it. It's impossible for us to. So we have to use our bodies and our language and our capabilities as humans to describe the world. And it's just, I think, I wouldn't care if either one are human. They're both human. It's more like what is, I think, I don't know, what is preferable. Like what is preferable and what's most useful. And like I said, like maybe you're explaining to children, like it has to have a shape. And, the danger, I think, with, making concept into cartoon characters, I think is where it becomes, and especially in the modern world, I think that's where we go with it.
Marvel movies.
Yeah, Marvel movies. It becomes very cartoonish very quickly. And, then that almost becomes childish, whereas, but even, I mean, if you think about the Greek statues being painted, like they were very cartoony, especially, I mean, if you think about it compared to like, we see them as those white, pure things with like blank eyes, which makes them seem more like gods to me. But they really didn't have those. They didn't see them that way. They just drew them they made them people, just like the Marvel characters, really.
Yeah. Well, and that was one of the criticisms that Socrates gives in Plato's Republic of Homer's gods is like they're described as almost like a soap opera. Olympus is this absolute
100%.
There's nothing more not human, but almost ridiculously human in their interactions with each other. And either it's a caricature of extreme blasphemy, or perhaps there's some kind of profundity hidden beneath that caricature. And of course, the Neoplatonists and and Christians, Augustine in particular, took the former form. Like our Christian God is superior because you don't even take your own God seriously. Then the Nietzschean view is that no, there is a profundity to the image, to the superficiality. And I love the way that Nietzsche, this one always stuck with me, just said, what if truth is a woman? Not even a particular depiction, a generalized depiction of this concept, a personification of a concept that isn't even like a god exactly. Truth isn't a god per se. It certainly shouldn't be treated like a god if you're Nietzsche. And he said it's this mercurial thing that has reasons for hiding her reasons. And it conveys the point, and it conveys, because what he says is that nature uses our instincts to accomplish its will. People having kids isn't beneficial to you as an individual. It's beneficial to nature's purpose. Nature uses your horniness to accomplish its ends. And if you perhaps knew the cost, you might not go through with it. Well, maybe with a deeper understanding, you would go through it anyways, but it has reasons for hiding her reasons, he says.
And that's so Nietzsche, because obviously he's speaking as a philosopher's philosopher. And, as I mentioned last time, whenever you talk about masculinity, you're talking about commanding something that's wild and chaotic and mercurial and unpredictable.
Yeah.
And what could be more like that than the truth to a philosopher.
And ungraspable, unfortunately, or fortunately, perhaps. But it's Nietzsche is an interesting one, because we were talking about this with the group, and Nietzsche came up because we were talking about the difference between these religious traditions that deeply oppose any form of not just anthropomorphization, but representation of any kind. Mm-hmm. Not just no statues, but if you are Orthodox Jewish, for example, you can't even say Yahweh. You can only spell out the consonants between the vowels, or however it works, to indicate the direction of the thing that you're speaking of, but not the name itself. It's like bear for the Indo-European bear cults. You don't say the the name. You only have the euphemism for fear of invoking the thing. But there's that on the one hand, this absolute opposition to any kind of anthropomorphization, and then on the other hand, there are Nietzsche's favorite people, the Greeks, with their very human-like depiction of these soap opera characters as their gods. And we thought, well, what if the Nietzschean point here is that the people who embrace anthropomorphization and the humanization of these gods can do so because they love life and they love being human. Whereas these other traditions, looking largely at monotheism, not exclusively, but largely at monotheism, that oppose this, that reject icons, that reject depictions and stuff, have a kind of hatred or disgust towards life and towards the flesh, and especially towards sex and towards the imperfection of the human form. And they have a kind of preference for that Platonic perfection and ideal. When you look at Islamic art, for example, and the insides of their, I'm forgetting the name, their temples, it's all geometrical designs. It's all very like mathematical, and a lot of math and arithmetic deriving its name from an Islamic scholar, or algebra. I'm sorry, not arithmetic, algebra. There we go. Algebra. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. Like comes from that in a very idealistic way, but there seems to be a different relationship to the human body and to human life between the religions that are willing and even embrace anthropomorphic depictions of the gods versus those who reject them. Or at least that was an idea that we were toying around with.
And as a lover of Nietzsche and a lover of the phrase despisers of the body, which encapsulates so much, especially even up until now, you have the transhumanists are the new despisers of the body. And that's just the next iteration of this whole trend towards we hate all earthly things. We want to transcend humanity. Whereas, yes, I mean, I think, our thing and solar idealism and just generally this vitalism that I think a lot of us are attracted to is very much like, enjoy your body, enjoy your life, be healthy, be beautiful, that, and to imagine that that's possible. I mean, I think, it feels like a lot of these ideas are come up with by ugly people. Like I feel like if you have handsome guy privilege, like, why would you hate your body? And people who are athletic and people who use their body and are like impressed by what they can do and so forth, I think are very much more life loving, and it feels the way you're describing it. It also feels very Mediterranean. Yeah, like hey, let's have some like some wine on the beach.
Enjoy life,
and just enjoy life, and also the drama of all the drama of that. It goes with it.
There's this delicious Joseph Campbell quote about how life is like an opera, except that it hurts, and there are parts that are painful. But your job is to play those roles and to play them decently. And there is a way to enjoy and here we're going into Albert Camus territory, to enjoy the bad stuff as well as the good stuff, to see that as a challenge to overcome. And I think the thing that makes Nietzsche so likable after, digging a little into his biography is that Nietzsche did not have handsome guy privilege by any stretch of the imagination. And he struggled not just with ladies, but with health more generally and sickliness. And his understanding of the effect of sickness and that kind of misfortune on philosophy, you get the sense that it comes from personal experience and introspection. But he was somehow able to overcome that in a way that I think very few thinkers are truly able to do.
That is such an important point about Nietzsche, and I mean, I like to think I do this with certain things as well. There's this idea that especially it bugs me. I see it online a lot, that you have to embody the form to speak about it or to say that it's good. You have to embody the form just to say what is good. And that's so bad, because it means that that only people who embody the form can agree on what's good.
It's it's almost useful is the problem, because it's actually not a bad heuristic sometimes, but it brings the double trap of oftentimes the people who best embody the form are the worst at explaining it, because they're naturals and they have no idea how they do it. They just are. Exactly. And if they give
that's
you
what happened
advice,
with masculinity for many years. Like who was talking about it? Nobody. The guys who were good at it were just good at it.
Yeah. And they'll give you advice that totally will not work for you.
Right.
And conversely, there are people who are outsiders, who are not naturals, who had to spend a lot of time working through it. And oftentimes they don't get through it, and they become bitter and resentful. But there's
Nietzsche's the whole thing that gets to resentment is that he really recognizes that resentment is there, and he sees it in himself, the temptation, I think, of resentment. Or I'm guessing that. I mean, I don't know him, but I'm guessing that he sees in himself the temptation towards resentment, and he fights it.
Oh yeah. There's this beautiful line in Thus Spake Zarathustra, where he's talking about the tarantulas and how their whole notion of justice is vengeance. Might have been inspirational to me in other domains. But he says to me, what was the line? He says, escape from resentment is a rainbow after long storms, and is the path to the highest heights. But the tarantulas would have it otherwise. What justice means to us is to fill the world with the storms of our vengeance, and to go from there. So escaping the contagious poison of resentment was Nietzsche's whole project. Yeah. That was his whole, and there something felt very personal in that, especially as it pertains to Christianity. The fun fact with Nietzsche to me was that, for all of his, vitriol and even hatred that he heaps on Christianity, his father was a Lutheran pastor who died.
Yeah, he went to school originally to be a pastor. That was
Well, and Nietzsche and Nietzsche's father, the elder Nietzsche, I suppose, died when Friedrich was 6. Yeah, and the accounts I read said that Friedrich was actually very fond of his father and looked up to him, and perhaps there might have been some idea that his beliefs about the weakness and even the biological weakness, the tendency, the slave morality tendency over time of Christianity might in some way be to blame for his father's death. So maybe some hatred of Christianity came from that. But he for all of his serious criticisms, he never resented Jesus. He even had a kind of respect. He saw him as this kind of Zarathustra-esque character who gave a kind of Buddhist-like message. He's like, it's interesting. There's good points and bad points. Paul's different. Paul, I can see my own resentful tendencies in Paul. I can see it. It takes one to know one, and I can see it.
Yeah.
So there's he's an interesting character, but his very insightful view of the relationship between philosophy and the body, I think, could very plausibly be tied, to bring it back to our ostensible topic, to anthropomorphic versus absolutely iconoclastic conceptions of ideals and the gods.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I like your point on that too. I mean, I like the idea of representing the gods as having beautiful, perfect forms, as the Greeks did, represents that you think, highly of the human form and highly of living and of life.
Yeah.
And so that's definitely.
But if you don't like the human form, then maybe your view of the Greek depictions of the gods will also not be so high, because they are merely human.
Very, very, very human. And like you said about the opera and the drama and everything about the Greek gods, that's definitely all there. And that's always what I liked about them. Specifically that they're deathless, but they act just like, they're on a soap opera.
Yeah. Well, and that was one of the, everyone, craps on, what was that, like 2002, 2004 movie Troy, for being, it's not the Iliad. It kind of tries to loosely follow the story. It's its own thing. If you don't view it in relation to the Iliad, you'll have a better time. It's just a fun action movie. But it did have some good lines. And one line where Brad Pitt says, the gods envy us because we're mortal, and everything we do is more beautiful because we're doomed. We'll never be here again. That is not a Homeric line, but it could be. Like that is exactly something that Homer might have said. And it very much matches sort of Nietzsche's conception of the Homeric embrace of the beauty and wonder of life in The Birth of Tragedy, where he deals extensively with the very black-pilling wisdom of Silenus, where the old centaur says, to King Midas, I think he says, mortal who is, born to suffer and toil, best of all would to have been never to have been born, but second best is to die and die soon. And like that is actually the view of a lot of people within a if you hate life, if you are a negative utilitarian, I forget the name of the main guy in that world, where it's like, on the balance, suffering outweighs pleasure, so it's best if people don't live. There are those kinds of negative I'm misusing the phrase negative utilitarian, but that kind of utilitarian. There are certain kinds of Buddhists that go that way, and like you mentioned before, transhumanists.
Yeah, I think, antinatalists they're that way. Yeah, and just it goes back to the whole Buddhist look at the world. Which there are Buddhists who will disagree with this, of course, but the idea that life is suffering,
right? And Jordan Peterson says the same thing. Life is suffering, and the best you can do is find meaning in the suffering, which is, I guess, if you're depressed, maybe somewhere to start. It's
terrifically masochistic and like
a little bit.
Wild. Yeah. I mean, life is beautiful.
But what's wild is
there's a lot of things that are cool in the world.
Oh yeah, but what's wild is these are. It's on the one hand, it's very hard to connect with for me personally.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you can look back and see books like Ecclesiastes or the Iliad or Gilgamesh, where people are contemplating these questions. Would it have been better to have never been born? There's something that the oldest book in the Bible, I think, Job, which is a very pagan book, as is Ecclesiastes. You will not find a more nihilistic book than Ecclesiastes. The whole book is vanity of vanities. Everything is vanity. There's no point to doing anything I acquired all the wealth, I acquired all the women, I tried pleasure, I tried hard work, I tried business, I tried all the things, and nothing mattered. There is no point to anything. So how do you live a good life when nothing matters? There's nothing new. Everything will be as it always has been. Your life doesn't matter. You will die. And you see this theme keep popping
the dragon.
up. Yeah.
I know his voice. That's the dragon.
And it is fascinating to see how different cultures answer this, because that's Silenus as well.
Yeah.
And how you answer the dragon seems to shape the rest of the religious feeling in a given tradition. It seems the Greeks had a different answer to it than the Buddhists have. The Buddhists are like, oh, we shall become one with the dragon, and then it's not a problem anymore. I'm probably being unfair.
We're gonna get like Buddhist hate mail.
Oh yeah.
That's not what we do. Yeah.
Yeah. No, we know.
Yeah.
But like Nietzsche's view of the Greek answer is the fact that the gods themselves desired to live out the drama of human life spoke to the value of mortal life and its increased value because of its scarcity, perhaps. And that's what makes that line from Troy so, despite all the just absolutely horrific archery and just terrible combat and terrible outfits and all that, and like okay acting, but mostly not great. There's still one great line that makes it perhaps worthwhile and relevant to these broader discussions about the actual ancient Greek stuff. And the Sumerian stuff that we see in like Gilgamesh and elsewhere.
Yeah. Well, and the message was to go and enjoy your life.
Yeah.
Epic of Gilgamesh was like
well, that's what the woman says.
Yeah, that's what the woman says. Well, and normally I don't listen to women, but in this particular case, we'll entertain that because that was kind of the balancing fact. Because no, you're going to die after his quest to not die. He talks to this woman and she's like, no, there's a lot of living to do, essentially. There's a lot to enjoy about life, so you should do that.
Yeah.
And you could take that into a direction that it would go down into a road of like pure hedonism. And I've known guys who've said that to me. I could think of one that I'm not going to mention, but it specifically, but like people who say that life is experience, and I'm here to experience things, and that's not wrong. It is experience, but I'm here to rack up like interesting experiences.
Yeah, I mean that's one frame, and it's like you say, it's not wrong, but how you frame what life is, and there's probably an infinite number of ways to frame it in a way that is factually correct, but will guide you towards different experiences. And it takes a little bit of foresight to anticipate what those experiences are going to be like later on in life. I mean one book to keep it nominally on the subject of anthropomorphization that tries to address this question of how do you live a good life is Plato's Republic. And in Plato's Republic, the dragon is a young sophist named Thrasymachus, who says justice is just the will of the stronger, or the interest of the stronger, I should say. Basically, there is no justice. So the best in life is to tyrannize over others. And but that conversation is actually preceded by a conversation with an older man who Socrates is speaking with, named Cephalus, who's Socrates is asking him, what's it like being old? How is it? How are you doing now that you're kind of on death's doorstep? And Cephalus says, oh, it's not so bad. People say, oh, you have it good because you're wealthy, and it's true that wealth hurts, but not wealth isn't bad, but not for the reasons people think it is. And It says, with, now in my old age, the things I did in my youth hit me differently. And the stories that I used to laugh away as silly, I now, keep me awake at night. And the true value of money in my old age is that I can die without debts, which is a very, it's a different experience. And I think the people who say, well, life's about experiences, and I'm here to rack up as many experiences as possible in a very hedonic fashion. You can read basically any wisdom tradition anywhere, and it says, there are negative experiences that follow from that path. You can take it, but it's that is the I don't know how to say this. Maybe to borrow some anthropomorphization from before, the dragon, which is a funny anthropomorphization when we think about it, luring you to astray for who knows what reason.
Yeah, I always think of the dragon. I was going to say, if we wanted to really talk about anthropomorphization, we could actually try and sketch that out. Like, what do these characters look like?
Well, how would you talk about the dragon of negation, which I think we all kind of understand. I hope anyone listening to this will know the force we're talking about. How would you talk about that force without personifying it?
Oh, well, I would. Perfect example actually is I bring it up all the time, but the never-ending story of the nothing is what it would be.
But the nothing
and then the wolf speaks for the nothing,
right?
And the wolf would be the dragon. He's the analog to the dragon in our story, or our story really being the oldest story of humankind. Because the dragon is obviously not my invention. It's everybody. It's Mitra and all the other. There's always a dragon, and it's always associated with
or the worm with the tail in its own mouth, the Ouroboros.
And that's a great symbol. And I didn't understand. It teaches you a lot about things, and the Ouroboros is actually a great symbol for exactly what we're talking about. It's this kind of a forbidden knowledge of that everything eats itself and becomes its own thing. Everything.
Well, it's not to stay with Christianity this long, but it's also the snake in the garden.
That's
an obvious one.
Yeah, it's the same symbolism because it's visceral.
But how would you
visceral
explain
response to snakes for obvious reasons? Because they're dangerous, and also they're hidden and they can scare us and surprise us. Yeah, and humans have a kind of visceral response to that naturally. And all the symbolism is there is this thing that's in the shadows, that's bite is hidden and can come out from nowhere and get you. And that's what we're really talking about. We're talking about this scary thing that is really a stand-in for death. That's what the dragon really is a stand-in for death. That nothing really matters is death. It's the death of all meaning.
Yeah. Well, I think it's more than death, isn't it? Or death is inevitable. The dragon isn't just saying you're going to die.
No.
The dragon seems to be saying you're going to die, so you may as well get it over with.
Yeah, or that just nothing matters. So you're going to die, so nothing matters, I think is more what the dragon said. Like, nothing matters. You're going to return to dust. Nothing, meaning is meaningless. And so that's, I think, really what the dragon is saying. Like, return to the source, return to dirt, because that's really what chaos is. Return to the undifferentiated world.
And this is, I think, to me, the value of at least sometimes having anthropomorphization on the table. Because how could we speak, of a concept or a symbol as having an intention, which I think it clearly does. The dragon does seem to be a force. It isn't just empty space in the universe beyond, the asteroid belt, out in the universe. It is a direction and an intention that seems to exist in the human species. and in the world. And I don't know how you would talk about that, that idea that pops up from time to time without personification.
I'm cycling through like psychological concepts and thinking about like the Freudian death drive concept, and also
Thanatos, yes,
and also Jungian shadow. You know, and I don't know how close it would be to Jungian shadow, but sometimes I could see that. You know, like as far as like, or just the id bubbling up, but that's a little too simplified, I think. But yeah, this idea that, well, it's this perception of truth. You know, and that's why it's always like, you know, the Ouroboros and all these things is like secret knowledge for like alchemists and philosophers and all that, because it is the deeper truth. It's not wrong. Like, eventually your name will be forgotten. Eventually, you know, things won't matter in the way that they matter now. You know, eventually you will die. Eventually, all these things, and they're not wrong.
The premise is not wrong, but the conclusion that the dragon tries to argue from that true premise, there has to be some answer. There has to be some way to say, no, that conclusion, I should kill myself. I should act as if nothing matters. I should, you know, follow Marquis de Sade or whomever, because nothing matters. It does not follow from there is no objective meaning. True premise, not necessarily true conclusion. But how you cut those 2 points seems to vary from culture to culture, and that's, well, I guess that's sort of part of the project of the Order of Fire. And this whole exploration.
Absolutely. Well, you have like this idea that, I mean, we're perceiving that truth, right? That we know that that's real, that it doesn't follow that you have to just descend into complete nihilism and whatever. And that's what we're saying. Right? It does. Yes, that is true. What the dragon is saying is not wrong. And as a species, we've always known this. You know, like it's not like we do. People were much closer to death than we are now, and that's why, you know, like in the ancient world, everything is about luck and whether the gods are mad at you or not or whatever, because it just might be your day. You know, like, and it still might just be your day. I could, you know, get in a car accident tomorrow, but like I think life was much more hanging on a thread in earlier times than we feel it today. So I think people always felt that, you know, like it could be over tomorrow. They, you know, like I think they were aware of this, and like, oh well, grandma's dead, or like my brother's dead, or whatever. Like right now, like that, he now knows that nothing happened. You know, like he lived and well, there he is, and we see this as humans, and there is the possible response of, well, then, you know, fuck it. That like let's do coke and fuck hookers, or like or whatever, you know. And or you could do that, or you could take, you know, the opposite approach that, you know, this kind of, you know, whatever vitalist or you know, the solar idealist approach that well, you're here for X amount of time, so while you live, shine, like do something, make use of your life. Like, do something that you're proud of.
And what's on the other side of that disillusionment? Because it seems that so often the words of the dragon or the snake, which is, you know, this questioning, critical deconstruction of the worldview that gave meaning to your existence before. Like, when a worldview collapses, it can feel like your whole world collapsed. But, you know, there is existence on the other side of that, and that's a whole new exploration you can go on the other side of, maybe to bring it back to anthropomorphization, the collapse of our conceptualizations and our depictions and images of the gods and the powers and our ideals that be, because those are perhaps also at the end of the day false. They are not true. And that includes, by the way, the depictions of the gods that define themselves as truth itself. That is also false. But like, that doesn't mean that they aren't worth employing and even living by. And this is why I loved Greg Naja's depiction, description of myth, not as stories we believe in, but stories to live by, where, the value is not the truth, but the beauty of the story conveyed there. And I think that's where Nietzsche was getting to when he was beginning to dismiss the value of truth and say, maybe truth is like a woman who has reasons for hiding her reasons. And maybe it isn't the best thing for us to be like Egyptian youths always trying to pull the covers off the statues and to uncover everything. Maybe we can just make do with the image without delving down below.
Yeah, and that also gets in. I won't foreshadow that too much, but the essay that you're working on, the idea of there being no premises, and like that's I'm very interested in that, just because I think it fits into everything that we're talking about. But you magically brought me around full circle to another Thomas Carlyle quote that I read earlier today, as you talked about times of confusion and so forth. He was talking about it too. And what did he rate this in? Probably like 1890 something.
Sounds about right.
It sounds about right. But and that gives us a little perspective as well. But he was talking about, obviously, hero worship as a central theme in human life, as worshiping something better. And he says, does not every true man feel that he is himself made higher by doing reverence to what is really above him? No nobler or more blessed feeling dwells in man's heart. And to me, it is very cheering to consider that no skeptical logic or general triviality, insincerity or aridity of any time and its influences can destroy this noble, inborn loyalty and worship that is in man. In times of unbelief, which soon have to become times of revolution, much downrushing, sorrowful decay and ruin is visible to everybody. For myself in these days, I seem to see in this indestructibility of hero worship the everlasting adamant lower than which the confused wreck of revolutionary things cannot fall. The confused wreck of things crumbling and even crashing and tumbling all around us in these revolutionary ages will get down so far, but no farther. It is an eternal cornerstone from which they can begin to build themselves up again. That man, in some sense or other, worships heroes that we, all of us, reverence and must ever reverence great men. This is, to me, the living rock amid all rushings down whatsoever, the one fixed point in modern revolutionary history, otherwise as if bottomless and shoreless.
What a white pill.
Yeah, right? Very white pill. Like it's only going to go so far, and then men have to look upward again.
It's the white pill of all white pills. This is our inescapable nature to find our way out of this, depression of the bottomless pit of logic, and to find beauty in hero worship again.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that is a nice little bow on this discussion. So I'm going to leave it there. We are going to do part 2 and talk to Ed. Ed Haman, our Vedic expert. We're going to bring him in and talk a little bit, because he's been kicking this idea around a lot in his group, his fire within the Order of Fire. And he's also, has some ideas and some background from the Vedic material that he wants to bring into the discussion as well. So whether it's the next podcast or the podcast after that, we're going to hit this idea of anthropomorphizing gods, or the shapes of gods again with Ed. So everyone, thank you for joining us, Mr. Robertson. Always lovely talking to you, and stay solar.
Stay solar.
Pater is the cultural arm of the Order of Fire. For more, visit PH2T3R.com.